introduction is Miss Cami Anderson. She is the founder and managing partner of Third Way Solutions. Cami Anderson has spent 20 years as a chief executive in government and nonprofits focused on equity. Cami now leads Third Way Solutions, an organization dedicated to finding innovative 21st century intractable challenges leaders face in the pursuit of ambitious goals. Her organization recently launched the Discipline Revolution Project, a collective of leaders from across the country working to end the school to prison pipeline. Cami spent a decade leading high-profile turnaround efforts, starting out as the superintendent of New York City's alternative high schools, focusing on students facing the longest odds, programs for pregnant and parenting teams, schools on Rikers Island, career and technical training for adults returning to school, and then services for students in need of significant mental health and family support. After that, she led Newark Public Schools, putting in place key reforms that have led to notable increases in outcomes for all students in one struggling district. Cami has also served as the executive director of Teach for America New York, chief program officer of New Leaders for New Schools, issues and strategy director for the Friends of Cory Booker, and a middle school teacher. Cami is a lifelong advocate for gender equity, intersectional feminism, and Title IX, spearheading successful legal action against the University of California for gender discrimination in sports and helping found a Harlem women's movement. She was named one of Time's 100 most influential people and is the recipient of the Peter Jennings Award for Civic Excellence, the National Points of Light Award service, among other honors. She's widely published from the Wall Street Journal to The Hill to Education Week on issues of leadership and equity. A sister to 11 and an aunt to 18, Cami speaks and conducts training all over the country, including right here in Houston, Texas. And so we'll hear more about Cami Anderson. Thank you so much, Cami, for joining us. And without further ado, Cami Anderson.
Sierra, thank you so much. I don't know who wrote that bio, but it makes me sound much cooler than I think I actually am. So I really appreciate it. I have to say, as a former theater person, maybe once you're a theater person, you're always a theater person. I find these webinars to be the toughest because I don't get to see all of you and feel you and see how you're doing, especially now with just so much collective and individual trauma, and especially knowing all that you have been through recently, even with the weather and the power and the water. So I just am sending all the good vibes and love, and wish that we could be together in person, but we'll settle for Zoom, I guess. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do a couple things. So I'm going to sort of walk you through. I'll introduce myself a little bit more and what we do throughout the presentation. But I'm going to share my screen and kind of take you through who we are, why we do what we do, what we actually do to tackle the work. I'll give you a little bit of information and flavor about some things we're doing right there in Texas with a collaborative of superintendents and their teams in the Houston area. And then, I just want to leave it open for questions because I feel like, and Sierra, maybe you can help me at that point. I'll both read and monitor because I feel like these sessions are typically more useful if, they're in response to what's on your mind. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen, this is the most perilous part for me because technology is not my strong, but I'm embracing it. All right, I think I made it. I made it through the most stressful part of the day. So my talk today will focus on rethinking school culture and decriminalizing the way we think about student discipline, and I'll kind of dig in about what that means to us and what I've learned from folks that are a part of our collaborative. We are sort of guided by this North Star quote, which is, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I have spent actually more than 20 years at this point, close to 30, because time keeps a marching since you write bios, but years in education. And I will say that as a systems leader, and I can say this because I am one, it is really difficult to fix things unless you're brutally honest intellectually and psychologically about what's working and what's not. And then taking personal responsibility, both as a human and a leader, but also as a change agent to actively stop things that aren't working, to start things that need to be rethought, and to sustain and grow things that are. But I've never, ever led a fundamentally effective effort that isn't, deeply rooted in reflection and values and honesty about who is winning and who is not, right? So our team is guided by this Baldwin quote. We start every training with this Baldwin quote. I often tell systems leaders and principals, I can't help if you tell me everything's okay. And based on the outcomes we see for Black students and other students who are marginalized, none of us can say it's okay. So we strive for brutal honesty, but strive to help our clients and the people in our network move from admiring problems to solving them, but doing so in a sort of deep and reflective way. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we're doing this work, and even personally why I'm doing this work. I mean, you heard my bio. I've done a lot of things, and so I'm pretty obsessively focused on this piece around culture and the way we think about student behavior for a reason. And I'm about to share, of all the things I could be doing, right? There's a reason why this gets me up every day, and I'm just so fiercely focused on it. Not just me, but our whole team. So just to start with the hard facts, and you probably know some of this, so forgive me if you don't, but sometimes it's helpful to have it all in one place. But we know that Black and Latino students and students with disabilities are somewhere between 3 and 4 times more likely to be suspended than their peers, often for the exact same behaviors. So as one example, there was a study of about kindergartners, and where they watched the attention moves of the teacher, and whether they were positive, AKA nice job, Johnny, or negative, AKA please get online, Johnny. And they categorized all of them. And just as one example, Black boys in kindergarten were 2.5 times more likely to get negative attention than any of their peers. And again, often for the same actions, like being a kid, being a kindergartner. I don't know where my kindergarten teachers are at, but the Wiggles are part of the deal. So we know that the likelihood of a student being put out is dramatically changed by both their race and also their disability status. Just like incredibly biased juvenile justice and policing systems, the same thing happens in schools, which is that the police are called more often on Black students. And that results in school-based arrests, which, as many of you know, have the same just deleterious and long-term effects as arrest in the community. So more than 50% of student arrests are Black students, even though they make up only 16% of the student population. So the same, biases and over-policing of Black bodies happens right in our schools, just like it does in our communities. And then finally, LGBTQ students, and we use QQ because while I'm not a member of this community, I've asked quite a few advocates and members of the community what they prefer, and just making sure that it's both queer and questioning, because gender non-binary status is very much a thing for this next generation in ways it wasn't even for us. And it's important for us as adults to know that. And this community is often left out of the discussion about disproportionality because, rightfully so, you can't go into your databases and figure out who identifies as LGBTQ, and nor should you. But lots of longitudinal and qualitative studies show that LGBTQ students are very much disproportionately impacted. And God forbid you are a member of all of these categories. If you're a Black student who's also has an IEP and identifies as LGBTQ, obviously the odds of you being on the receiving end of harsh and biased discipline go up just dramatically. And I should also say, when I was in New York City, I oversaw the 1-year suspension centers for the system and the 30, 60, 90-day suspension centers. By the way, terrible ideas. I hope no one has any of those, but we did. And a lot of systems do. As superintendent, they happen to be in my portfolio, and I didn't need any of this research and data. All I needed was my eyeballs to tell me that the young people who ended up in our suspension centers absolutely did not reflect the diversity of the city. They were disproportionately Black, brown, students with disabilities, and students who identified as LGBTQ. So, you know, it was a profoundly emotional experience to walk into those suspension centers, and very emotional. You know, data is data, but I carry those faces and those students and their spirits with me everywhere beyond these numbers. This is this issue is front and center every day. These headlines are just from the last 6 months. We're seeing disproportionality play out online. Mandatory reporting around who hasn't logged in. We send the cops to the house, and that's way more likely to happen for Black and brown students instead of wondering why they're not logging on, right? This latest study correlated lost instructional minutes with students in middle school and high school. And, it makes logical sense, but like we forget that not only is it morally wrong and it's violating students' civil rights to discriminate against them, but it's also just not smart. Like if they're not in our classrooms, they're not getting the instruction that they need and deserve. And then there was a beautiful story by Erica Green and one of her colleagues in the New York Times about disproportionality for Black girls. And in particular, just as an example, there was another study where teachers of all races, by the way, although white teachers were bigger offenders, categorized Black girls as being less innocent, more aggressive, without even knowing that, right? By showing them a series of pictures and cards. So we know that we have deeply entrenched biases in our systems. And again, I should say, like, it is true that white teachers were bigger offenders of those stereotypes, but they existed across the board. So these are just headlines from the last 6 months, and I could go into more of them, but this is another part of our compelling why. So the over-policing in schools is profound. I know in Texas, so in New York City, just as an example, everyone sort of handles this differently. Sometimes you have school resource officers that work for the school system. Sometimes you have, police officers that work for the external police department that are off-sited. And sometimes you have your own police force. And I know from my work with the Houston Collaborative, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that many systems in Texas have their own police forces. And, again, we all know that there are law enforcement officers, school and otherwise, who are incredible, who know how to build relationships, who are integral parts of school communities and sometimes serve as critical, role models and coaches and supports for students. And then we all know there are those who, were trained in a particular way. We're trained to stop emerging crimes and respond to threats and, bring a sort of energy and training to learning spaces that can be really deleterious for students. So as a result, just to give you one snapshot in New York, where I worked for many years, we know that students who are suspended are 3 times more likely to drop out and be court involved. And I'll just give you one example. Even if you were suspended 2 times versus 1 time in a year, your chances of being connected to the juvenile system the very next year tripled. So I'm going to say that again, just 1 more suspension tripled the likelihood that the student would be connected to the juvenile system the very next year, right? And as another example, we talked about this in the previous slide, 60% of the students arrested at school are Black, even though they represent only 30% of the student population. And again, arrests and being connected to law enforcement, like these are things that like we as human beings and community members often think of being, things we want to avoid at all costs for our own family, for our own kids, for us. But somehow we like don't make the connection that it's just as problematic psychologically and for life choices when it happens in school, in some cases worse. This is just sample Houston data. We've been working with 7 superintendents, 6 traditional and 1 charter network in the Houston area, and their teams on a community of practice that meets once a month and kind of goes deep on some of these issues. And this is just a sample that we see. If you're able to look at this, you can see a direct correlation in a bad way between the achievement gap, which is a problematic term, the opportunity gap, the percentage of students who are not the reading on grade level, and how that correlates directly to out of school suspension. So the other thing, and you know this, right? Like, so goes suspension data, so goes outcomes. This is also Houston data, and basically saying that nearly 50% of the referrals to probation are Black students, which is a hugely, much larger than the percent that they represent in the community. So this is actual data from Houston. And again, I think sometimes people, probably not everyone on this call, but often folks think of like solving the discipline disproportionality problem as being like a nice to have, like it's not, like it's over there, and getting better outcomes for students is over here, but no, they're like directly and causally related. So basically a big study out of Stanford essentially said that you can predict how Black students are doing by looking at discipline data. And so goes the discipline gap, so goes student achievement. And again, forgive the achievement gap language. It's not one I prefer, but it is how it shows up in the research, if you will. So it's directly related to like the goal of helping students not only feel seen, heard, and ready to achieve, but also like do the thing we're supposed to do, which is like teach them how to read, write, and do math at high levels and graduate with tons of life options. And so we talk about ending the school to prison pipeline, and it is an uncomfortable term, but we do that deliberately. And I just want to, because it's thrown around, we often take a minute to just define what we mean by that. And so basically it is, you have more suspensions, more school-based arrests of students of color, students with disabilities, and LGBTQ students, which then leads to, right, not only the psychological impact of that, which we know is incredibly problematic, but also a decrease in time on task. Like the very students who likely need more instruction, more of the thing that we're offering, get less of it, which then means they're, much more likely to disconnect from school, and both because of the stereotypes that are heaped upon them, but also because of the time out of school, they're more likely to be connected to the juvenile system, which then means they're almost statistically certain to be connected to the adult system. And, disgustingly and inappropriately, once you're connected to the adult system, it's generally a life deal that leads to all kinds of legalized discrimination in housing, employment, healthcare, all kinds of things. So when we make decisions about putting a kid out or having them arrested or any such things, and sometimes there is good reason why you need to separate a kid from their peers, but these are very weighty decisions, and it has been my experience, and the research would support that we should think of it that way, right? So that's partly why we're so focused on this issue. So that's our why. I spent more time on the why than I probably will on anything else, because again, you all are here at this equity symposium likely because you have a fire in your belly to address inequities. But I'm still surprised by people who I feel like should know better, like thinking that how we treat kids and how they are experiencing our cultures and our climates, and whether or not they feel seen and heard, like that's not really the main event of what educators should be thinking about. And I just like fundamentally disagree with that. I believe, like all of you, in incredibly high quality and culturally competent tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 curricula. I believe in clean facilities and all the other things that matter to ensure that all of our kids excel. But I just feel like we don't spend enough time with urgency on this piece of the work. So that's why I spent a little bit of time on the why. Just quickly on the who. So this is just give you a sense of our team. We are all folks who have worked in schools and in some cases in child welfare agencies and wraparound services. And I think we all share kind of two big things. One is a real belief that culture and climate and how one handles difference and struggle and conflict is endemic of one's culture, in good ways or in bad. And then two, we believe in deep technical and adaptive change, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Like we really try to straddle hardcore tactical solutions like policies and procedures and ladders of escalation and all that sort of technical stuff, codes of conduct, right? With some of the much more deep adaptive work on mindsets. And so this is the team, and everyone sort of brings those two pieces to the party. We have a set of core values that sort of undergird the work that we do around discipline. And these began when I was superintendent of Newark. And I'll just tell you quickly about this, which is, we had a lot of things we had to change when I first got to Newark. We had probably a dozen schools where 20% or fewer of students were reading and doing math at grade level, which by the way, obviously they could, that wasn't about them, right? That was about us adults having to really organize ourselves differently and change some things. So we had a lot of things we had to change. And we were dogged about selecting high quality tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 curricula that was culturally competent. We were dogged about upgrading facilities. We were dogged about making sure we had just exemplary principals and best in class teachers, great, all those things. But like the thing that was the hardest to change, if I'm really honest, was the culture and the underlying set of beliefs that we were acting out every day, both implicitly and explicitly, and just how we treated kids. So I literally couldn't wrap my head around it. And so one of the big breakthroughs was working with a group of folks from the community and teachers, principals, et cetera, to like come up with a set of values that would guide all of that, like that would serve as like the sort of like North Star against which we mapped everything. Policies, capacity building, training, professional development. I used to say all the time, we are not going to curriculum or PD our way out of this problem. We're not. So we had to get under the hood even more deeply, and we did so in a pretty inclusive manner. And then that work that we did in Newark, which kind of broke open a whole set of change, is the work that we now carry through with some of our partners. So here are the values. So we believe adults can prevent most incidents by building relationships, helping kids practice good habits, and understanding that behavior is a form of communication. So this is very empowering, right? So like, if you think that incidents are just inevitable and kids are to be controlled, and that discipline's about response and containment, then that's like pretty disempowering. So this one, if it's taught properly, can feel very empowering to people. The second is we believe mistakes are sometimes inadvertent and always opportunities to learn, and that all kids deserve forgiveness and chances, right? And so the true story about number 2 is we do, like most school systems, not all, kind of believe this for white kids and for kids who are not disabled, for kids who don't, like if you really watched it, like we sort of believe this for some kids, but not for all kids. And so this one is so important to assert because it seems like so obvious, except this is where you see such incredible double standards and racial biases show up. We have to be real about that. Number 3, we believe that schools can keep kids psychologically and physically safe and hold students accountable in ways that are about limiting shame and exclusion. So, kids make mistakes and they do things sometimes that are not great and sometimes really, really not great. But we know from basic achievement motivation and behavioral theory that the least effective way to help build new habits is to wag your finger and shame kids. Same thing is true in our own lives, right? If you have to lose weight or, you know, improve your communication skills, the surest way not to do that is to sort of beat yourself up when you're not making progress, or worse, have somebody else. So that's our third core value. The fourth one is we believe we're all products of society with inherent biases, and that we have to actively guard against those biases, particularly in how we handle incidents, conflict, and difference. And we'll get into this a little more, but there are practical ways in which we can all understand, you know, how we enact in our individual interactions and in our decisions some of the societal isms that play out every day in classrooms and schools. And we believe that the role of school discipline-wise is not to control or police students, but to help them master healthy habits of mind personally and academically. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but just what I want you to take away from this is, like, sometimes people call us when they're like, well, we want you to give a training on classroom management, or we want you to look at our discipline policies to help us, like, make them more, make them less biased, or we want you to, you know, help us revise our code of conduct. And I'm like, yeah, we'll do that, but according to what set of values are you going to do that, right? And so taking the time to really lay out your values, which sometimes is about directly asserting what you want to be as opposed to what you are, right? You can imagine these 5 values, they were basically a positive way of saying what we wanted to stop doing. Our North Star to move away from what wasn't working for us. And then these values helped us to go do all those other things, because all the decisions we made about people, policies, practices, capacity building were all aligned to these values. So I just want to, that's the main point that I want to make with this slide. So let me walk you through kind of what we do in a sort of tactical way. And then I'm going to ask for help with Q&A, because I want to make sure that I'm answering any questions that you have. So what do we do? So we're basically asking for folks to radically rethink the way they think about the word discipline and how we handle discipline. And you can see it's flipping 180 degrees, because we don't think we just need a little bit of a shift. We think we need like a radical 180. And we want folks to shift from thinking about discipline as being control, punishment, containment, to the original word in Latin that means mastering something through practice, right? Dogged practice. So just like you think about a disciplined artist or a disciplined athlete, right? Those aren't the most talented folks. They're the ones that are doggedly practicing something. So we want folks to really embrace a new definition of discipline. And the way we kind of think about this, for whatever it's worth, you all know this, but when you look at really high performing schools, like schools that are crushing it with all kids, particularly students who are often marginalized, including Black students, LGBTQ students, students living below the poverty level, students with IEPs. So schools that are just crushing it, right? They're like getting awesome results for all kids. They do 4 things really well. They have really high quality instruction with rigorous, relevant, culturally competent content. So like good tools that are just expertly mapped, well utilized. They have great people with the right mindsets. So not just the right skills, but the right values and will, right? Skills and will. They have top-notch systems and operations, like the facilities are clean, the budgets are aligned to goals, the trains run on time. When you walk in as a parent, someone actually says hello to you, which, as we all know, not always the case. And then they do this 4th leg really well, which is social, emotional supports, learning rituals, culture, all the things I'm talking about. And so we basically focus on how to help systems and schools get better at this 4th leg of the stool, not because we don't think the other 3 are important, but because we think this 4th one is so often underinvested in, misunderstood, and left out of the conversation for a host of reasons, which we're going to talk about. But we essentially help on 3 levels. So we talk about creating the conditions for students to feel seen, heard, and thrive. And so that's about anti-bias cultures that are characterized by high expectations and high support. So high, the research says high expectations, high support. Can't have high expectations with no support. You can't have high support with no high expectations, right? And that's where things like adult biases come to play, because over and over again, as one example, we inadvertently communicate to Black kids that they are not smart enough, or that we assume they're going to misbehave, or any of the things. And same thing with students with disabilities. So conditions are about the culture, capacity, so adult skill and will in managing struggle, difference, and incidents. So we basically say it's all the things you do to prevent incidents, that's conditions. And then it's all the things you do to respond when these things show up at your doorstep, because it's part of life. And your values are either lived or violated most in times of conflict, right? So when we work with folks, we talk about creating the conditions to prevent incidents and creating the capacity to respond in developmentally appropriate ways when it does. And then finally, the idea of student and family well-being and care, and just really thinking about all of the mindsets that need to be explicitly broken down about seeing families as our partners, right? Not as the people we call just to report when something has gone wrong, and seeing students as little people who can learn and grow with our coaching and support, as opposed to needing to be contained or confined or policed. So these are the 3 C's that we talk about in that 4th leg of the stool. And it's interesting. We are not, honestly, we're nothing new. We're not a new program, a new package, anything. We just took what happens with this 4th leg of the stool. And I don't know if you all have experienced this, but 3 things I found. One is the work in the 4th leg of the stool gets really preachy and finger waggy. And you're like, okay, I don't know. I have no idea how to operationalize that. That's one problem. The other is we think about this as a fragmented piece. We have a anti-bias, anti-racist workshop on Monday, a culturally responsive workshop on Tuesday, and they're all thought of as disparate pieces, right? And we think of it as one piece of the puzzle. And what we've done is we've taken if you saw previous slide, all the research that we believe has great things to bear with all of the promising practices, and we've sort of put them into a one-stop shopping framework called the equity framework that talks about 6 building blocks, and it defines what does success look like at the school level and what does success look like at the systems level. And I want to just pause here for a sec to get really concrete about how we use this framework, and specifically how we're even using this framework in Texas right now. So the mayor of Houston, Mayor Turner, and the public health chief, Christie, they launched a citywide implicit bias initiative a while back, and brought together a diverse set of stakeholders to really identify what the levers of change are for the city of Houston. And one of them was around addressing biases in student discipline. And so through the mayor's office, we were invited to recruit 7 systems in the surrounding Houston area, HISD and other Spring Branch. I think some of our partners are on here. Hi, if you're there. I wish I could see you and invite you to say more, but that's not how this works. And basically what we're doing with that collaborative is each system chose 5 to 7 cross-functional leaders, because in order to fix this problem, it's inherently across many departments, right? Academics has to be involved, school culture and climate has to be involved, whoever runs safety, whoever runs special ed. So every group has formed what we call a district working team. And as a community of practice, we meet every month to go deep on one of these building blocks. So we explore the research, the promising practices, and then we have time for us to surface what we're learning nationally, but also for the group to surface what's happening locally in terms of successes and areas for growth. So just wanted to kind of give you some texture about how we use this framework and how, in particular, how we're working right there in Houston. It's been an incredibly powerful experience, I think, for all of us. And we certainly have learned a lot nationally, but I think, the power of the community of practice right there in Houston has been obviously everyone learning from one another as well. I'm going to skip that. So one thing we help folks to really understand, especially now in the age of COVID and other things, is the intersection of physical safety, psychological safety, and emotional safety. Often when we hear the word safety, we're thinking of physical safety. And again, especially now, rightfully so, freedom from getting sick, from worse, right? And also, in the age of school shootings, then physical safety meant, freedom from any kind of violent act against you, right? And so definitely an important thing that we're all responsible for as educators, no question. And it's like a huge responsibility right now. It's like a crushingly huge responsibility. But we also feel very strongly that psychological and emotional safety is also our job. And if we don't think about these three things together, that it can be really deleterious for student experience, which is ultimately necessary for kids to learn. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we know about physical safety, right? Physical safety, we all know, protection from violence, theft, exposure to weapons, all the things, and freedom from physical harm. And so just three things that we know from research. One, that the history of school policing is just inextricably tied to the bias, costly over-policing of Black communities, right? So okay, we think physical safety, but we don't often realize that the sort of backbone of school policing is just as fraught as community policing. The second thing we know is, and that uniformed school safety personnel doesn't lead to fewer incidents. I mean, this is like study after study after study. Now, I'm not here to tell you that means tomorrow you're not going to have anyone in uniform. And again, remember what I said, I know personally, and from Newark and beyond, uniformed officers who've been incredible. Like, so I'm notwithstanding that, just systemically, I think people think, oh, more uniforms equals more safety. And just statistically, that's just not true. And what is true, though, is that the more uniformed personnel, the more likely students are to be arrested, right? It just makes sense. Like, that's what you do. And of course, because of disproportionality, that is what ends up happening. So while this is uncomfortable, I mean, I would argue what you do with this information has to be highly differentiated to your communities, but that this is true is like, not, it is what it is. These are some facts that we know from the research. Emotional safety is really based on an attachment that's formed with individuals and that allow you to feel vulnerable, to collaborate, to dream, to be creative, and feel compassion. And so one thing that's super interesting to me and so important for all of us to wrestle with, we spend a lot of time training teachers on lesson planning, on classroom management, again, but actually, like, trusting relationships is literally one of the most important school-based levers for student outcomes that we have in our toolkit. So in Chicago, over a 10-year period, a group of researchers surveyed students, families, and staff, and they correlated those survey responses with student outcomes. And they found that the single biggest determiner of student outcomes was trust in and among adults and trust between adults and students. So teachers are really not trained on this. Like, we're not trained on this. So breaking down what does trust mean? How do you form it? How is it broken? What does it mean in the context of power and authority? And all, it's just so important. And I don't think we can underestimate the power of demystifying what trusting relationships mean and practicing them and reflecting on them. And that we also know kids who experience breaks in attachment will test adults. So I am from a large family. I think Sierra mentioned in my bio, I have 11 siblings, 9 are adopted, mostly older when they joined our family and mostly through foster care. And so there's been some attachment breaks. And so they're going to test, right? So I used to say all the time in alternative high schools that when a student totally loses it on you, that means you probably are exactly where you need to be because they trust you and they're trying to see, are you too going to leave them, right? So again, I'm not saying you don't need to put in place structures and systems to make sure that a student losing it doesn't have a deleterious impact on other people, but we don't tend to think about things like that. Students who've experienced attachment, when they're trying to reattach, like they're going to fight a little bit because they're trying to see whether or not that attachment cycle is going to be repaired. And that we also know that trust and relationships are cemented or broken in times of strife and conflict, right? So the time to talk about how to fight in your marriage is not when you're fighting, even though sometimes I do that. But you know what I mean? Like you have to, having really good systems for unpacking conflict, repairing harm, and repairing relationships is mission critical to the ability to actually create emotional safety. And without emotional safety, no learning can occur. So I want to talk about psychological safety. So that is, you know, the belief that you're not going to be humiliated or punished if you speak up or ask questions or make mistakes. And this is the one that we violate all the time, right? So we know from research that shame and exclusion are the least effective means for behavior communication for this exact reason. So like if you mess up, right? And then it's called this shame cycle. This is what the research calls it. And then you're like, oh my gosh, like I messed up. And then you just shut down. And then you're just like retreating into your mistake. And by the way, you know, I ran the schools on Rikers Island, and I would see kids who are this, you know, first offense in an adult jail on Rikers, which is just like really a tough, awful place. They should close it. And you would talk to them and they would describe, this might resonate with some of you who've worked with young people who are overage, unaccredited, or incarcerated. And they will say the horizon just got farther and farther away. And so far that I couldn't see it anymore. And so I just like stayed on this boat, even though I realized the boat that I was on was dysfunctional because I could no longer see the shore. Right. And so this idea, and then they were just like, then I felt successful on this boat over here, even though I knew it was dysfunctional, but I just couldn't see that shore anymore. And it just felt too far away, right? And we also know that, you know, racial and other biases can create a guilty first environment for Black students and other underrepresented groups. And that in study after study, Black students, LGBTQ students with disabilities, students living below the poverty level say that they feel less seen, they feel less heard, they feel less connected to a caring adult. They survey data like an adult notices when I'm struggling, even when I don't ask. They report very low numbers there. So these environmental factors that are directly correlated to student achievement, we know that, you know, students that they play out differently for different students. And finally, you know, again, just like close your eyes and think about your own learning. Like, when have you learned the most, right? It's when you feel like you can take risks and when you can fail and when people give you grace when you mess up and when you feel like people truly care about you and are like, just like rooting for you to get to another place and are like, they're coaching you when you don't get there. So, you know, kids are no different, but my goodness, have I been in schools where I'm like, oh my gosh, like I cannot believe the way we speak to kids and how are we expecting them to get to the next level? And by the way, I'm about accountability and high standards and all the things, but I just think it's super important for us all to realize like basic motivation, like we're all motivated by high standards and doing more, but we're not motivated by feeling shamed and excluded and worried that we can't take a mistake. This is true for staff too. And, you know, there's plenty of research about why the field has a really hard time recruiting and retaining Black teachers and Black administrators, the same reason. So this idea of psychological safety is really important to keep in mind. So last piece here is on the how, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. So I just want to say a few things here. I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but probably a lot of you, the concept of technical versus adaptive change. But our team has found that in this fourth leg of the stool work, you've got to really dig into both, right? So technical problems are easy to identify. The solutions are cut and dry, revise the policy, do this, do that. They can be solved by the person at the top. They're just changing a few places and then you feel like you're doing something. Check, 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 right? But often the real work is on the deep values and relationship pieces that need to make shifts. Some of the core values that I signaled to you earlier and some of that deeper work. It's harder, it's longer term. It requires like building a groundswell, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's uncomfortable. And so we just believe that when it comes to the fourth leg of the stool and just in general, when it comes to really, really, really digging on equity and racial justice and other justice, that it's that uncomfortable adaptive work that will really lead to breakthroughs. So we really try to work with systems leaders and schools on embracing the both and of this. We have a framework for implementation. I'm not going to go through all this, but basically we talk to folks about people, policies, practices, power dynamics, and partners. So once you sort of get the equity framework, we're like, all right, and then you get your values, your North Star clear, then you got to take those new glasses and go look at all of your things to see what needs to change. How do you recruit, select, and onboard safety personnel, student support staff, teachers? Are you interviewing teachers for their ability to build relationships or just a lesson plan, right? Are you coaching them according to whether they have a clear learning objective, or are you doing that plus seeing how they interact with kids and create psychological safety? So people, right? Policies, like, is there a clear ladder of escalation? Do people know when it's okay to call for help in a classroom and why? And are folks like clear about how big of a decision that is? And when the person comes, maybe they take over the class and the teacher and the kid step out to work it out as opposed to pulling the kid out, right? So policies, practices, what do your student support teams look like? What is your, when you look at your professional development calendar, is it all tier 1 curriculum all day? Or do you have time to talk about how students are feeling and receiving information in a way that will allow them to learn? And then the ever uncomfortable power dynamics. Who's at what tables when decisions are made? And how do politics enter into that? And are those decisions aligned to your values? And then really importantly, partners, especially when it comes to safety, there's often child welfare involvement, police, either folks that work for y'all or folks that come in, after school providers, faith-based community. And, I can't tell you the number of times I've had conversations with school leaders where they're like, oh, well, that person doesn't work for me. Like they're like over there screaming at a kid, don't know what the goals of the schools, aren't values aligned. And they're like, well, they work for this CBO that comes in 2 days a week. I'm like, no, this is your house. It's your house. So the idea of like partners and getting everyone aligned around a set of values, and also just the muscle memory and the mindset and the structures to really think about families in a different way. COVID has put us in people's living rooms for the first time. We should have been there all along, but we're literally in people's living rooms. So it's just a real opportunity to rethink how we partner with families. Like they're the left hand, we're the right hand. I mean, that's never been more evident than right now. Like we will not succeed without them and vice versa, but we don't treat them that way, right? So this is the sort of framework we walk folks through, and we encourage systems and school leaders to basically, and communities, to think of this as a sustained stop and start, and to sort of go through an inventory, like what are all the, now we have our values, now we have the framework, what are the things we want to sustain, what are all the things we got to start? But what's super funny is the wrong word. What's super interesting to me about systems change is we never want to stop anything. We are so quick to layer dysfunction on top of dysfunction. Sometimes the work in adaptive change is as much about what we're going to stop doing and actively guard against as it is about some new initiative. And we just sometimes lack the courage to be like, we got to stop that. You know, we've got to stop using that person who does training on classroom management who's culturally incompetent. We got to stop that, because that person has trained hundreds of people in our community, and the way that they train on classroom management is culturally incompetent and values misaligned. We got to stop that. And we have to actively go and retrain those folks about how that's no longer aligned with our values. One example, right? We have to stop calling the meeting where we decide how long a student's going to be out a hearing. We have to stop issuing summons. I mean, what kind of freaking messages are we sending our children when we're issuing them summons for like something that happened at school? We got to stop that, right? We've got to stop hiring principals because they know someone and they're politically popular, even though we know they can't do the job. I'm just using examples, but we really push hard on our partners, back to my Baldwin quote, to be as reflective about what they need to stop doing as they are about what they need to start doing. And that's uncomfortable, but that our experience is that's the stuff of real change. And just some examples of adaptive versus technical versus adaptive shifts. So nothing wrong with hiring behavior specialists. Sometimes those folks are just incredible assets to community, people who really understand how behavior presents and what kids are trying to communicate and how to respond. But that is a technical fix, because if you have a school where there's lots of behavior and students need lots of things, like one person's never going to solve that. Everyone, values-based hiring, everyone in that school, right, needs to actually have a mindset that behavior is communication. So same thing on policy, right? So let's say you have the insight, well, people are just too quick to suspend. So we're going to put this little form out that says you have to show you've done all these interventions. Like, y'all know what I'm talking about. We do the same thing in special ed. We did all these things before we referred, and everyone's like, check, 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 initial the thing, right? And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that practice, but that's a technical fix. The deeper fix is, who is receiving the request to put a kid out? And are there checks and balances built into the system so that you make sure that biases aren't cemented, right? Practices, you know, I've seen people do this. And by the way, sometimes it's a good call. No one can be suspended, you know, in kindergarten. One example. No one can be suspended, and you know, unless it's in this narrow band of things. And sometimes that needs to happen because it sends a message and it requires a shock to the system. But the deeper prize is, do people throughout the system like truly believe that behavior is communication, right? And they're not just like not suspending because someone told them they couldn't. Like, they're doing it because they believe that that behavior is communication, that doing things differently is going to be good for kids, right? Power dynamics, right? This idea of adults as controllers versus adults as enablers and empowerers of children. And you know, I gave this example earlier, but a technical, you know, people talk, well, you know, we're getting sued or someone complained and we have to make sure parents are involved earlier in the suspension process. But a technical solution is, fine, we're going to require that parents are notified, right? Again, okay. But the real prize is, we're actually going to think of them as their partners, because if the student is presenting with these negative behaviors, like, we got to get under the hood together and figure it out, right? So sure, you can add a notification system so that you're not, you know, calling parents at the 11th hour once their kid is in real trouble. But the prize is the deeper work on truly seeing them as partners. So these are just some examples that I wanted to kind of pause on to sort of punctuate why our team feels so strongly about the intersection of the technical and the adaptive work. So that is my last slide, and I would love to take any questions that you have. Sierra, I don't know if it doesn't look like there's a ton in the chat. I can't have been that thorough, people. Hold on, stop share. And Sierra, maybe if you don't see any in the chat, maybe you have some that you would like to pose based on your work or what you heard.
Yeah. So there is one. Are there exemplars in the school culture work that can give us clear goals to push for in the Houston area regarding policy or metrics or experience in the short term and long term?
So I would answer, so I can't give you like names of schools, right? Because our work in the Houston area so far has been A, at the systems level, and B, remote. But certainly we know from research what exemplar schools look like, sound like, feel like, which I'm happy to make available to you, right? Case studies and all the things. We know that things like student surveys, which I could also provide, some samples, can be one of the most, so pause, metrics. There's three buckets that I would look for on metrics. Okay, so on exemplars, the reality is I don't have specific names, but I certainly could help you understand in a more concrete manner what that looks like. On the metrics, let me just give you a couple of points on that. One, obviously disproportionality data across the board is necessary to look at outside of just suspensions. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You have to look at school-based arrests, in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, referral to anything that's not in the learning space. So any ED, referrals for SPED, transfers, kids who left, right? Dare I say school-based arrests? So the reason why I'm saying that, physical restraints, okay? So when you look at metrics around disproportionality, you got to look at all of that in one dashboard, because it's like the bump in the rug. I've worked in systems that are like, oh, we cut suspensions in half and like triple the number of kids were transferred. We're like, oh, we're going to give them a fresh start. No, like transferring a kid is incredibly deleterious and usually leads to them dropping out, even when it's well-intentioned. So, oh, we cut suspensions in half and now we just call the police because it's a different attendance code. So it doesn't count for suspensions, but the kid's arrested, right? Or, oh, we're gonna cut down on suspensions, but now we have physical restraints, go up. So one is just looking at that metrics across the board, right? The second is to look at student attitudinal survey data. These survey data, they are useful, by the way, to look at staff as well. But here's the thing that's so incredible about student survey data, and people get really uncomfortable when I say this, but whatever. Student survey data is incredibly predictive of student achievement, like even more so than teacher observation feedback, which, by the way, that's like terrifying, but it's true. It speaks to the need for all of us to up our game on quality of our feedback for teachers. But actually student attitudinal survey data is as predictive in some studies, if not more, as is teacher observation data. Like I'm not surprised by that, because when I was a teacher, I used to ask my kids for feedback, and let me tell you what, that's all I needed to know. Okay, so survey data is powerful, particularly from students. Obviously asking staff is critical, but it's really highly predictive of how kids are feeling and then therefore how they're achieving. And then finally, from a metrics and measurement standpoint, the other thing that I urge folks to do is go look at whatever your teacher evaluation system is. So I'll just give you a concrete example from Newark. We had a Fine Enough rubric. I think it was like Charlotte Danielson or something. I don't know, one of the main events. And somewhere along the way, someone had basically like ranked what mattered. You know what I mean? Like they were like, oh, you get 3 points for like a clear learning objective, and you get 4 points for instructional strategies, and like you got 0.5 points for the whole relationship bucket. I was like, that's weird. And part of it is you dig in, right? And part of it was I learned two things. One, well, it's not as important as the other ones. No. And two, it's harder to evaluate. Okay, well then let's do some work on norming. So the other, so the other sort of metric I would look at is in your evaluation systems, teacher, student support, principal, like what is the tool you have around relationships and trust and psychological safety? And are you using it well? What is your day? The other thing we learned, not only did you only get 0.5 for it, but everybody apparently was amazing at it. There was like, everyone was getting 5s. I was like, wow, I walk into our schools and I'm horrified by how we're treating kids, but we're all 5s on relationships. That's amazing. So that is another metric to pay attention to. Go look and see whatever those things are in your system. See if people are using it. See if it's been normed and what your data is telling you. Like, if everyone's getting 5s, like something's wrong. So those are kind of 3 like metric buckets I would think about.
And I know that when you and your team when school districts approach you and your team, if you are brand new to this work, and you are approached, where should a superintendent or leadership team start? What are some great starting places to enter into creating more equitable outcomes for their district?
It's a good question. It sort of depends. Part of what we do, honestly, is that's why we created the framework, was to like give everyone like a backbone, but then also turn a team loose to go through a self-assessment process. And then as part of that, figure out their peaks and their strengths and weaknesses. And as a group with our support, figure out the highest leverage actions based on their context, right? So like, I think the playbook is like, the equity framework and the playbook is deeply important. But figuring out highest and best leverage point has got to be school and systems specific. And I just want to say, once someone put in something about young people, I want to give one concrete example. Hi, Paul. I want to give one concrete example. In Newark, we created. So we had 5 comprehensive high schools, and you might imagine that was actually one of our biggest challenges, where we had lots of incidents, tons of people in uniform. Like I was like, oh great, like we have all this like uniform, but it's like it wasn't safe. You know what I mean? So what we did is we formed teams that included young people, school assigned officers, SROs, community-based partners, families, the principal and their administrative team, teachers, right? So each school had like a team of folks, including young people, and everyone went through an entire week together where they would like learn content, but this actually goes to the other question, learn promising practices, get all the tools, but then they would like spend the afternoon saying, what does that mean for Central High School or Week Wake or whatever? And the young people were right there at the table, like, taking what they learned. Like, it wasn't a whiteboard exercise because we know some things, right? We shouldn't be starting everything from scratch, but it also, the teams themselves then took that information and sort of made it real for their community with young people right there alongside the adults. And it was incredibly powerful. And that process we then sort of replicated every summer. But I will tell you that the change between the year we did those deep, like, because we made some changes, right? But like, it's just like the year we took the time to do that team planning and common training approach, made that fall, we saw an immediate difference. And, part of it was having young people right there at the table who were invested in the plan. And part of it was the time and space to create plans that were like individualized and truly owned by the folks at the school and the community. Because the other thing is there were several of those schools, who had, a church right across the street or a huge community-based agency across the street. And that was a game changer as well, because they then felt super invested, because sometimes those are the people calling the cops. You know what I mean? So that team-based approach was really worked for us, and we've worked with some other systems to do something similar.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This, even in 1 hour, just extremely informative and empowering and engaging, really gives us a great lens into the work that goes on in equity, and especially what's happening right here in Harris County with a few of our school districts. So just truly appreciate your presence and your wisdom and knowledge and your expertise, and just looking forward to working with you in the future as we